Hello student, welcome to this course BGS 011 Understanding Gender and Law. Um, in this part 2 of mapping sexualities, we are going to discuss about how to locate sexuality in its historical existence and changes, and then analyze the sexuality in relation to identify and the notion of the power. So these are the two objectives which I'm going to speak through this lecture. So, in order to think about the social field within which sexual cultures are embedded, it is important to historicize sexuality. For instance, ideas about sexuality as about its relationship to gender have developed through time in conjunction with a number of other factors. Within this context, we must also think of how sexual cultures are located within fields of power. Let me also clarify to you that when we are talking about this, this whole debate on multiple sexualities, the ways in which culture operates, the key factor is that the ways in which society operate, of course there's inequality, the ways in which you see in the society the gender biases are there are power relationship. So one has to keep it in mind and just sort of try to observe from your childhood how the power relationship works or function in and around. So, in all cultures, including the European, a wide variety of the conception of gender and sexuality existed before the advent of the modern era. Many forms of expression, body appearance, gesture, voice, and so on were seen to be a part of male and female, and a broad range of sexual behavior were tolerated. Some theorists now argue for a strong connection between modernity and the emergence of norms around gender identities and sexual behavior. This concern the consolidation of the hierarchies such that certain kinds of gender identities and specific forms of sexualities were seen to be superior to the others. So, for example, masculine, men, and heterosexuality became the standards for normality. And you can, in fact, relate this debate in order to understand, quickly, I would say that if one has to locate this debate, masculinity and men, you can see the ways in which it operates in everyday life, right? So, looking at some example, let us keep it in mind the link between the gender and sexuality. Historical analysis tells us that the two are mutually reinforcing concept and each helps define the other, right? We will explore three other contexts, those that have particular relevance of non-Western societies. The colonial era was particularly important as a context that allows us to understand the social and political nature of sexuality. In fact, I would urge all of you to have a look at this book, Theorizing Patriarchy by Sylvia Wolby, who contributed this wonderful book in the year 1991. And if we want to really sort of understand the Western society, particularly the British, because we do have the colonial period, we know that the British rule our country, but how those issues emerge and how the brutality of the law was existing, the colonial laws, which she sort of tried to explain also partly, not fully, but you can sort of understand through this book. So indeed, the sexual politics of the colonialism was one of the most significant strands in discourses that justified colonial rule, provided index of the difference between European and non-European, as well as lay at the basis of European anxieties about colonialism. A significant justification for colonial rule lay in the frequently, retired notion of the reform that was required within colonized society. Native sexual modes were frequently regarded as object of such reform and were also held up proof of the moral inferiority of the colonized population. So, colonized society were seen to be characterized by a passionate unreason and unruliness. And Levine's book is very famous for that. You can always go and have a look at this. So, with regard to the sexual behavior, and it was a common belief that native religion and other beliefs justify loose sexual modes. This lack of reason, and I'm quoting from his book, lack of reason in sexual arena marooned colonial incapability for the self-rule, unquote. Further, while on one hand a significant colonial fear concerned around the threat to the white woman's resident in the colonial form, the uncontrollably, lascivious black men. And this discussion you can see, because if you look at the Guyana's debate, one would see that many of these stereotypes remain with us to this day. And you can have a look at the literature which is there written on Afro-American blacks, the ways in which the life and the stereotypes about the blacks have been portrayed. There were they were both differences and similarities between the sexual cultures of the colonial masters and the colonized subject around the world. And yet the similarities tended to the largely denied. Why was this happen? We need to, raise this question, right? For example, there was a widespread prevalence of the homoeroticism among European populations in the colonies, and for many European men in particular, the relative lack of the proscriptions against homoerotism was a key attraction for traveling and working in the colonies. It could be suggested that the sameness of the some of the sexual practices of the ruler and the ruled was a key trait to claim of the moral and cultural superiority by colonial powers. Hence, the assertion of the sexual difference became an important part of the discourse of the European superiority. The production of the colonial discourses around the sexual and gender identities were significantly focused on the aspect that the gender and the sexual identities of the colonized were different from those of the colonizing populations. It is this context that need to be kept in mind when we consider the reason for promulgation of the colonial laws that sought to be normalize sexual behavior in the colonies. As it is well known, and Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, drafted in 1816 and passed and so on after, and the ways in which it has been defined that the carnal intercourse against the order of the nature. The fact that the same-sex behavior among the consenting adults were only decriminalized in India in 2009 also tells us about the overlap between the sexual politics of the colonial and the post-colonial eras. Now, it's been also important to understand the linkages of the sexuality, identity, and the power. There are different ways in which the field of the sexuality acts as a significant sign of identity, whether this relates to gender, community, or nation. Let us consider some context to understand this debate further. So, sexual identities are simultaneously historical and contingent. This is to say, they have an unstable nature that is influenced by social and cultural circumstances. Further, There's no necessary link between sexual practice and sexual identity. So, in many non-Western countries, non-heterosexual behavior does not necessarily lead to an assumption of being of a gay identity. However, while we may say that sexual identities are fiction, invented and fluid, they can also serve the very real role of acting as a point of resistance and support. This is most obviously true in the case of, say, homosexuality. In the West, for example, construction of the gay community has been central to responses to the HIV and the AIDS. And these debates in fact emerge in 90s onwards at international level, as Foucault was talking about it. But Indian context also you would see this debate emerge in order to understand what we call it today. I mean, there's of course been a criticism to sex work, but this debate emerged in Indian context. The HIV and the AIDS say that 90s onwards only. So similarly, the emergence of the gay groups in non-Western countries has served to intervene in and guide, among other things, the debate around compulsory heterosexuality. Additionally, such groups have also intervened in debate about the other kinds of norms formulated by the post-colonial nation state. This includes those that have to do with the ideas of authentic Indian cultures, and in fact, in African culture, it's there, that are not being destroyed by the westernization. So, writers and activists linked to the gay, lesbian, queer movements in non-Western countries have played an important role in rethinking notion of the ideal family and the normative gender identities. There is a persistent debate among scholars and activists in many non-Western countries regarding lesbian, gay and queer identities that are centered around the idea that there are Western identities and not really relevant in the context of non-heterosexual behavior in non-Western countries. This is significant discussion for at least three reasons: that cultural differences are important to consider, that non-heterosexual behavior has also been a normal aspect of, say, Indian cultures, for instance, and sexual identities are also class identities in as much as gay and lesbian in India. And I would in fact add, as Ashley Tillis pointed out to us, that the caste also in Indian context matters when we are dealing with the LGBTQ issues. India might be term that circulated in relatively privileged contexts. Notwithstanding this, many would argue that gay, lesbian, queer identities are significant aspect of contemporary sexual politics within non-Western countries and should be given the same attention as the indigenous categories. After all, we don't refuse to travel in train or use electricity because they originated from the West. So, gender and sexuality are not merely the ways of describing specific social relation. They are also sites of contestation and transformation of collective and personal identities. Hence, simultaneously, as gender and sexual norm, in particular, society seek to produce ideas about what our culture is. They also give rise to counter discourse and movements of resistance of these norms. The contestation of the established norms is itself a struggle for recognition. It asks that actually existing state of affairs be recognized for what they are, actually existing, rather than be treated as a non-existence through defining norms that wish it away. So, woman's desire, gender operation, normative behaviors, and realities of the human existence, and cannot simply be swiped away by ideas of the feminine purity, the natural superiority of the man, and the naturalization of the heterosexuality is there. The transsexual and transgender histories of the different society around the world points to a multitude of the sexual and gender identities and the behavior. For instance, the hijras of India, the kotis of the Thailand, and the waria of Indonesia are the only three of the several such long established identities. Many writers on transgender issues, and one of them is Richard Jung, notes that, and I quote from his work, have referred to culture system in which third gender or sexes have an established role in order to develop a critique of the flexity and the universality of the contemporary Western taxonomies of gender and sex. Unquote. And that the existence, and again I'm quoting from his work, the existence of the other culture taxonomies is a part of larger body of the evidence supporting the claim that Western model of the sex, gender and sexuality do not reflect some bedrock culture necessity, but one of the several roads of historical development that are open to further change. So, given these alternative sexual histories, the situation of the post colonial modernity, which such realities are sought to be suppressed and incorporated into monolithic nationalism, myth of heteronormativity is striking one. The history of the colonial and post colonial modernity in our region is, in fact, one of the suppression and marginalization of gender and sexual identities that did not or do not live up to heterosexual ideal that were produced through a collaboration between colonial discourse and native elite that aspired to emulate norms defined by colonizing powers. So, both hijras and kotis, the former may be transversalities or transsexual, and the latter is a Thai term for the biological homomorphic, face considerable discrimination in their society. This is despite the fact that within Hinduism, hijras have enjoyed well defined rituals, religious roles, and within Thai cultures, kotis have historically occupied a traditionally recognized third gender categories. The colonial period was significant watershed in making of the modern cultures of the sexualities in post-colonial society. So certain acts and behaviors were criminalized, others were put forward as a normative, withstanding the adoption of the colonial legal moral attitudes towards sexuality in most post-colonial societies. There is a great deal of historical as well as contemporary evidences that points to the existence of the well-established context of homoeroticism in the countries of the region. So, in performative tradition in India, such as in Marathi, Parsi, Gujarati theatres, men who acted as a woman were performed to women actors. And I just wanted to cite one example. You can have a look at the history of Marathi theatre. Bal Gandharva was the one of them who used to perform this. In contemporary Afghanistan, the tradition known as Bachchabazi of the older married man keeping young man companions in a common one. That is, in a later case, it has also become context of sexual exploitation, thus not itself undermine the idea of homoeroticism in the region. That is, in later case, it has become a context of sexual exploitation, does not itself undermine the idea of homoeroticism in the region. The important issue here is the existence of parallel strands of the homoeroticism and homophobia. Contemporary evidence that points out to the existence of the well established context of homoeroticism in the countries of the region. So, in performative tradition in India, such as Marathi, Parsi, Gujarati theatres, men who acted as a woman were preferred to women actors. And in contemporary Afghanistan, the tradition known as bachabazi of the older married men keeping young men companies is a common one. So that is a later case, it has become a context of sexual exploitation. Fine. So why is it that, for example, the Iranian law permits sex change operation, but the homosexuality is punishable by death? There are at least two distinct but related contexts that need to be engaged with. The first relates to the difference between the behavior and identity, and the second to the notion of masculine identity. The term gay is a part of identity politics of homosexuality that pertains both of self identification as well as the assertion of the rights to openly adopt certain lifestyle characteristics. Now, as a considerable research shows, there is no dearth of men in different parts of the world who have homoerotic relation but do not identify as either gay or homosexual. The latter aspect relates both to the notion that homoeroticism is an unexceptional part of men's lives as well as the idea that homosexual men are effeminate or woman-like. Hence, while a large number of men have relationship with other men, there is a stigma of being a woman being, in relationship. So different terminologies, Kothis or Pathis in India, for example, expresses these anxieties. Hence, simultaneously as a homosexuality is considered a life cycle activity or harmless pastime, it is also situated in the context where it does not disturb traditional notion of masculine identity and responsibility. For instance, to get married, to the provider, to extend the lineage, and etc. So, though it is different situation, and as in Guyana pointed out, white it is true that samba practices there and homoerotic insentimentation is there. They lack the category of the homosexual, have no homosexual to fix the category even if they did. And this is to say, while non heteronormative behavior is very much part of the PNG cultures, the manner in which it is conceptualized may be quite different from that is in the West. The term men who have sex with men was introduced into HIV and the AIDS prevention and in late 1980s in order to account for the group that was considered at risk but could not be accounted for through an identity related terms such as gay. If the culture, politics, and the debates, as Cohen argues, around terms such as that and others that have gained prominence through NGO activism reminded us that classification have the complex social history and are not naturally produced. They are only importantly point to the possibilities of the change through research, agitation, and activism. There is an additional complications to the above that has to be to do with the debate on imposition of the Western universalizing categories and non-Western societies. Many scholars and activism now suggest that we ought to simultaneously recognize the long history of non-heteronormativity behavior in Asia Pacific as well as resist the temptation to simply label these under the rubric of gay and queer. The latter context, it is suggested, ignore the manner in which particular penetrative Western discourse has, intellect, sexuality, gay rights, human rights, Oriental conditions, and the social Darwinism in confronting the question of the same-sex desire and practices in non-Western world. So moving on the other context of identity, one of the ways in which sexuality, gender and community identity come together can be explored through the notion of honor killing that are prevalent in India and Pakistan and other countries in South Asia as well. Right? So honor killing occurs for different reasons. However, the most frequent reason concern perceived transgressions of the family and community boundaries when an offending couple decides to marry on its own accord. It is noticeable that there are more women victims of the honor killing than the men. The most significant aspect of the honor concerns the control of the woman's sexuality by men that is seen to be suffered a slight when a woman makes her own decision regarding the marital bond. Courts do punish the perpetrators of such crimes. However, they frequently reflect society-wide attitudes to masculine ideas regarding female sexuality. So, for example, in many cases, a patriarchal bias is there embedded in the application of the laws has meant that instead of systematically intervening to address the violation of the rights of the lives, judges have focused on the victim's conduct and have been influenced by and reflected customary attitudes condoning the control of the violence, control of and violence against women. So even in most progressive judgments uh, to date, when dealing with the honor killing, in fact, let me also briefly point out here that feminists have contested this debate of honor killing, which they are, raise the question whose honor one is talking about. But to make you understand, simply I'm using this to that initially most of us used to try to use this, but eventually the feminists question the language also, particularly legal scholars. The court have continued to focus on the issues of the provocation. Judges, as Patricia O'Brien, one of the known sociologists, point out that, and I quote from her work, bring to their interpretation of the law very masculinist sex role stereotypes while manifestly upholding the cause of the woman, unquote. So let me conclude this lecture by pointing out that, through this lecture, what I was trying to, sort of focus on multiple histories from the West to India and the other parts of the world. At the same time, how this discourse of the sexuality and the multiple sexuality and identity was cutting across from colonial, post-colonial period in order to understand these categories. So, and to map out that how eventually the shift happened among the West and non-Western world, how in 1980s, 90s onwards through this debate of HIV/AIDS, this discourse of sexuality emerged, and there's a criticism how coming up on and off in order to understand in different cultures. So we need to recognize this, that East versus West, this how this debate emerged, and how eventually the scholars from India, like for instance, um, bringing out in forefront that we need to recognize in Indian, Indonesian and other contexts that traditionally they were always been there. There was religious sanctity to these categories, but over a period of time, how the shift has happened. So thank you.